They came to conquer a broken species. They found something that had already survived its own extinction twice and was still walking around making jokes about it. The Galactic Sovereignty Council had a word for species like humanity. The word translated loosely to manageable. It was a bureaucratic word, a filing cabinet word. It meant primitive enough to fold, advanced enough to be useful, no real complications expected. 43 civilizations had received that label before Earth. 43 civilizations now paid taxes to the Council and built Council roads and sent Council representatives to Council meetings where Council decisions were made without them. The process was clean, efficient, almost elegant in how little it required. A show of force, a broadcast of terms, a deadline, then either compliance or a demonstration, and demonstrations never needed to happen twice because word traveled and the galaxy had a long memory for the things it had seen burn. Fleet Commander Drexvahl of the Sovereignty's 9th Expeditionary had personally overseen 14 of those processes. He was not a cruel being. He did not enjoy the demonstrations. He simply understood that the architecture of peace required, occasionally, that someone be made an example of, and he was professionally suited to the task. Earth was supposed to be number 44. The preliminary survey drones had returned with standard data. One inhabited planet, third from a medium-class star. Bipedal dominant species, carbon-based, tribal in origin, nation-state in current organization. Technologically at what the Council's classification system called Tier 2, capable of atmospheric flight, early orbital capability, rudimentary computation networks, no faster-than-light travel, no energy weapons of consequence. Tier 2 species surrendered before the deadline 91% of the time. Drexvahl had reviewed the file on the journey from the outer rim. He had noted the planet's geopolitical fragmentation, hundreds of separate nation-states, dozens of active conflicts, a species that appeared to be at war with itself more often than not. He had considered this a favorable indicator. Divided species unified quickly under external pressure, and unified species that had just been frightened were compliant species. He had not considered it a problem. He had not read the footnotes. The footnote in question was a single line, appended by a junior analyst on the survey team who had clearly been writing a dry report for many hours and was perhaps no longer fully engaged. It read, "Subject species has been in continuous organized warfare for approximately 10,000 years with no recorded cessation exceeding 40 years. Notable." And then the analyst had moved on to the atmospheric composition data. Drexvahl's fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system on what the humans called a Tuesday. The timing was calculated. The Council's xenopsychologists recommended planetary approaches in daylight hours of the dominant population center for maximum visual impact. A silhouette against a star was more frightening than a shape in darkness. Fear, the Council had learned, was more efficient when it had something to see. 14 warships, each one roughly the mass of a small mountain. The Council's signature silver-white hull plating, shaped like something between a cathedral and a knife, designed by species who understood that aesthetics were a weapon too. They were genuinely, objectively terrifying. The humans took pictures. Drexvahl watched the communication feeds in something approaching disbelief as the transmissions multiplied across the planet's networks. The images spread in seconds. Then came the commentary. Then came what his translator struggled with for nearly 30 seconds before producing a result he read 3 times to make sure the translation was correct. The dominant sentiment was not fear. It was, according to his translator, something closest to, "Oh, we are so cooked, El Mao." He did not know what El Mao meant. His cultural database had no entry. He flagged it for his xenolinguist and moved on to the formal broadcast. The terms were standard: sovereignty recognition, resource allocation agreements, integration into council infrastructure, population census and classification, a delegation to arrive within 72 of their hours to begin formal proceedings. The broadcast went out on all detectable frequencies. It was, as always, firm, clear, unarguable. The response came 11 minutes later. It was not from a government. It was not from a military command. It was a transmission from what his database identified as a content creator, an individual human who recorded themselves speaking directly into a small device, apparently from a room full of what appeared to be sleeping animals of various sizes. The human said in a tone that Drexvahal's translator marked as asterisk casual to the point of being physiologically concerning. Okay, so the aliens want us to just surrender? Bro. BRRRO, do they know what they're asking? Like, have they met us? The sleeping animals did not stir. 40 minutes after that, Earth's various governments had collectively and somewhat chaotically issued a unified response. A thing that, his analysts told him, had never happened in recorded human history. The response was brief. It said that humanity was not at this time prepared to enter into sovereignty agreements and requested that the Council fleet maintain its current position while diplomatic channels were established. Diplomatic channels? Drexvahel stared at the message. A Tier 2 species, looking at 14 warships, had asked for a meeting. Not a surrender, a meeting. He granted it, partly because protocol required that he offer the option, partly because the xenopsychologists on staff were already vibrating with professional excitement in a way he found mildly alarming, and partly because some quiet, well-calibrated instinct in the back of his consciousness had begun, very softly, to suggest that the footnote deserved a second look. The human delegation arrived in a vessel that was, by every metric his sensors could produce, held together through some combination of mechanical stubbornness and collective refusal to acknowledge physics. It docked at his fleet's reception bay with a sound like a very large instrument being played by someone who had learned from a manual that was missing several pages. There were 3 of them. He had expected diplomats in formal regalia. Most Tier 2 species sent their most visually impressive representatives, their equivalent of plumage, whatever signaled status in their social hierarchy. These 3 wore what his database identified as business casual. One of them had what appeared to be a coffee stain on their jacket and had clearly decided this was not the day's most pressing concern. The lead diplomat, a woman named Vasquez, shook his primary appendage with a grip that briefly made him reconsider his assumptions about Tier 2 physical capability, smiled with a quantity of visible teeth that his cultural sensitivity training had not adequately prepared him for, and said, "Thanks for meeting with us. We really appreciate the patience." As though he had done them a favor. As though 14 warships were a scheduling inconvenience, they were graciously working around. He delivered the Council's position. Expansion was inevitable. Integration was the humane option. Resistance was possible but would produce outcomes that neither side wanted. He had given this speech in various forms many times. It was a good speech. It was true, which made it more effective than most. Vasquez listened with what seemed like genuine attention. She asked 2 clarifying questions about resource allocation timelines that were, he admitted to himself, more sophisticated than he had expected. Then she folded her hands on the table and said, "Okay, so here's our position." She did not unfold a document. She did not key up a data presentation. She just talked in the same direct, almost conversational tone as though they were discussing something ordinary. "We've been fighting wars on this planet for about 10,000 years, she said. We've fought wars over land, water, religion, money, language, the routes that salt used to travel, which family was supposed to sit on a specific chair in a specific building. We have fought over chairs. I want you to understand the level of commitment we bring to conflict." She paused. The coffee-stained jacket diplomat nodded as though this was a normal thing to be proud of. "We have also," Vasquez continued, "spent approximately the same amount of time getting very good at not dying. We have survived plagues that killed 1/3 of our population. We rebuilt. We have survived volcanic winters, ice ages, impacts from space. We have survived ourselves repeatedly, and every single time we come out the other side, we immediately start preparing for the next thing because we have learned, collectively and at great cost, that there is always a next thing." Drexvahal's cultural sensitivity training had a module on this kind of speech. It was called aggressive negotiation through historical cataloging, and it was typically a bluff, a way for weaker parties to inflate their perceived threat value by listing past hardships as though they were credentials. He had the planet's file open on his secondary screen, the historical data his survey team had collected. He had not, until this moment, read it carefully. He had reviewed the summary. He started reading it now while she talked. 10,000 years of documented continuous warfare. Not skirmishes, not border disputes. Organized, industrial-scale, coordinated killing with dedicated infrastructure, supply chains, research and development pipelines, entire branches of knowledge, medicine, metallurgy, chemistry, engineering, psychology, mathematics, all of them accelerated by the specific pressure of needing to defeat other humans before other humans defeated you. The humans had invented antibiotics in direct response to wound infections killing soldiers. They had invented flight within a decade of realizing it would help them drop explosives on each other. They had split the atom, cracked open the fundamental architecture of matter itself, because they were trying to end a war faster. They had not stumbled into military technology. They had sprinted toward it for millennia with the focused intensity of a species that had always had something to be afraid of, and had decided at some foundational cultural level that the correct response to fear was to get better at the thing that caused it. He looked at the fleet strength data his analysts had pulled. Earth currently had, and this number had come from their own public records, they had not hidden it, approximately 2 billion individuals with some form of active or reserve military training. 2 billion. The Council's entire standing fleet across all 43 integrated systems was 7 million personnel. He looked up from his screen. Vasquez was still talking. "So I want to be honest with you because I think honesty is more respectful than the alternative," she was saying. "And what I want to be honest about is that if this goes sideways, we are not going to fold. We are physically incapable of folding. We have tried to fold internally many times, and something in our collective psychology just doesn't. We get back up. It's a problem, actually. We've had many therapy sessions about it as a species, and we are still working through it." The third diplomat, who had not spoken yet, made a sound that Drexvahl's translator identified as a suppressed laugh. He sat with the numbers on his screen for a long moment. 14 warships. 2 billion soldiers. And the soldiers were being represented by someone with a coffee stain on their jacket, who was describing 10,000 years of unbroken warfare in the tone of a person listing minor personal quirks at a first introduction. The quiet instinct in the back of his consciousness was no longer quiet. He requested a recess. In the privacy of his command chamber, he pulled the full data package on human military history and read it with the kind of attention he had not given a target file in 14 campaigns. He read about a war that had involved 30 nations simultaneously and killed 70 million people in 4 years, and had ended only to immediately seed the conditions for another one. He read about a conflict in which a single country had fielded an army of over 10 million soldiers. He read about siege warfare, scorched earth tactics, the deliberate engineering of famine as a weapon, the construction of fortifications that took generations to build and were designed to be inhabited and defended by people who would never see them finished. He read about a thing called the Geneva Convention, a set of rules the humans had collectively agreed on, about how to conduct war humanely. And then he read about all the ways those rules had been broken and the arguments that had erupted over what exactly counted as a violation and whether it mattered. They had rules for their wars. They had lawyers for their wars. They had developed an entire academic discipline, pursued in universities, dedicated to the theory and ethics and history of organized killing. They called it military science. Science. He closed the file. He sat for a while in the silence of his command chamber, looking at the star his survey drones had classified as a medium-class, unremarkable stellar body, orbited by the most aggressively persistent species he had ever encountered documentation of, and he thought about the word the Council used. Manageable. He thought about the footnote. Subject species has been in continuous organized warfare for approximately 10,000 years, with no recorded cessation exceeding 40 years. Notable. Notables. He went back to the table. Vasquez was drinking from a container of what his database identified as coffee. She looked rested. She looked improbably like she was enjoying herself. "So," she said, "where were we?" Drexvahl looked at her for a moment, then at the fleet readouts on his wrist panel, then at the human vessel still docked in his bay making faint, complaining noises at regular intervals. "I think," he said slowly, "that we may have begun this conversation with some inaccurate assumptions on my part." Vasquez nodded. Her expression was pleasant, patient, and carried somewhere behind it the specific quality of someone who had known, from the moment she walked through the door, exactly how this conversation was going to go. "We have that effect on people," she said. The Council did not retreat. That was not in their institutional vocabulary. What they did instead was what powerful organizations always do when they encounter something they didn't plan for. They scheduled more meetings. Drexvahl filed his preliminary assessment report and used language careful enough that no one in the central bureaucracy could claim he had panicked, while being specific enough that anyone reading it carefully would understand that the situation required a different category of attention. He described Earth as *A non-standard integration candidate, requiring expanded diplomatic engagement prior to formal sovereignty proceedings. What he meant was, do not send a demonstration fleet. Send people who read footnotes. The council sent Admiral Shankara. This was either a sign that they had taken him seriously or a sign that they were running low on patience, because Admiral Shankara was not a diplomat. She was the being the council deployed when it wanted the situation to reach a conclusion, and she had a reputation that preceded her across 7-star systems for being absolutely, anatomically incapable of being surprised by anything. She arrived in a flagship that made Drexvahl's 14 warships look like a border patrol. It was the kind of vessel that rewrote what the word warship meant, a moving argument against resistance, a steel theorem proving that some conflicts had only one rational resolution. She reviewed his report on the journey and arrived at the human delegation's new meeting table already briefed, already assembled, already certain of the shape the conversation would take. The human delegation had grown. There were now 9 of them. A general in full uniform who sat with the stillness of someone who had trained his body not to telegraph anything. 2 scientists. A historian who had written, according to the file Drexvahl had pulled, the definitive academic text on what humans called asymmetric warfare, conflict in which one side is significantly outmatched by conventional measures and wins anyway. A diplomat. An economist. 2 advisors whose specific functions were not listed in any document Drexvahl had access to, and who had the particular quality of people who preferred it that way. And Vasquez again, still with her coffee. Shankara opened without preamble. She did not do preamble. She laid the council's full military capacity on the table in numbers. Not a threat, she specified, a data presentation, a context-establishing exercise. And then she outlined in precise and patient detail what integration under the sovereignty looked like for species that chose it versus species that did not. The general listened to the whole thing without moving. Then he asked, in a voice that had been trained to carry across a battlefield without rising, how long would a full military campaign against Earth take? Realistic estimate, accounting for our current defensive infrastructure and assuming we begin mobilization today. Shankara had the answer. She always had the answer. 18 to 24 of your months for orbital dominance, ground pacification of the populated continents, 7 to 10 years. The general nodded. Our estimate was 6 to 8 years for orbital resistance alone, assuming you don't use extinction-level ordnance, which I'm assuming you won't, because then you have nothing to integrate. Shankara looked at him. Your estimate. We've been working on it since your fleet dropped in. We have people who do this professionally. He said it the way someone states the temperature outside. We modeled several scenarios. You win. I want to be clear that our models show you win. But the cost-benefit on your side gets uncomfortable around month 14. The historian leaned forward. We also want to share something about the historical pattern of occupying Earth. There have been many attempts, internal ones mostly empires, various domination projects. The pattern is consistent. The occupation requires more resources to maintain than it generates, roughly 40 to 60 years in because of something we call insurgency. It doesn't end. It is, historically, the thing that doesn't end. We have fighting traditions that operate on generational timelines. The great-grandchildren of people who were not yet born when a conflict started have taken up that conflict. We don't recommend testing whether this applies to external occupiers. He said this with academic pleasantness, like a professor presenting data, and Drexvahl watched Shankara's expression do something he had never seen it do in 14 years of working under her command. It recalibrated. Not much. Not visibly, to anyone who didn't know her face well. But he knew her face well, and what he saw was the specific microadjustment of a being who has walked into a room with one model of reality and encountered information that requires the model to be updated. The economist spoke next. He was a small man with reading glasses and a spreadsheet that he turned around to face Shankara and didn't explain, just let her look at it. She looked at it for 30 seconds. "These are your war production numbers," she said. "Historical and projected," the economist said. "We ramped our entire industrial base to wartime production twice in the last century, both times in under 2 years. We have never fully demobilized since the second time. These are conservative projections, assuming we began full mobilization the day your fleet arrived, which we did." Drexvahl felt something he recognized, with some surprise, as the functional equivalent of cold. He had read about the wars. He had read the history. But history was dates and numbers, and the economic analysis had not been in his file, and looking at the spreadsheet now, the manufacturing curves, the resource extraction rates, the rate at which human industrial output could be redirected from civilian to military application. He understood something that the survey drone data had not communicated. The humans had not just been fighting wars for 10,000 years. They had been building. The entire time, in between the wars and through the wars, and because of the wars, they had been building the infrastructure to fight bigger ones. The scars of every conflict had become the blueprint for the next. Every devastating loss had become an engineering problem with a solution, and they had solved it, and then the solution had become the foundation for the next development. And on, compounding, for 10 millennia, until what you had was a species that had never really been at peace and therefore had never really stopped preparing. The general was talking again. "We want to be honest with you, Admiral. We're not going to pretend we can beat you in a straight fight in the next 5 years. We can't. You have technology we don't have. You have fleet numbers we don't have. What we have is time and stubbornness and a manufacturing base that your own analysts should be looking at very carefully." He set a folder on the table. Physical paper. Drexvahl found this detail strangely gripping. In an era of digital communication and holographic display, a folder of physical paper had a weight to it that was almost theatrical. "That's a proposal for a different kind of relationship," the general said. "Not integration, not surrender, an alliance. Because here's the thing, we've read your files too. You've had 14 acquisitions, 43 systems. And the thing your sovereignty keeps running into every couple of centuries is a threat at your eastern rim that you don't have the personnel depth to handle because your integrated species are administered, not invested. They pay taxes. They don't bleed for you." Shankara's expression was now doing something Drexvahl had a harder time reading. "We bleed for things," the general said. "It's honestly one of our more significant personality flaws. But if you point it in the right direction, it's also the thing that makes us worth more to you as a partner than as a province." The silence in the room had a texture to it. Drexvahl had been in many negotiations. He could read the silences. This one was the silence of someone doing mathematics in real time, running and rerunning a calculation, checking the result, not liking how clean it came out. Vasquez, who had been quiet for 40 minutes, took a sip of her coffee and said pleasantly, "We've also had time to review your Eastern Rim situation. The Vreth Collective, yes, we have some thoughts." Shankara looked at her. "You have thoughts about the Vreth Collective?" "Our historians do, and our generals, and also our strategists who work in a building that doesn't have its name on the outside, and I'm going to be honest, those are probably the thoughts worth listening to." What happened next happened in increments that each felt, individually, like small things. Shankara requested a 72-hour recess. The council, for the first time in Drexvahl's memory, did not question her request. She spent those 72 hours reading. He knew this because he brought her reports at intervals, and each time she was at her desk with a different document, and the documents were all human history, human military theory, human economic analysis, human strategic writing going back centuries. At one point he brought a meal that went cold, and she didn't notice. He read over her shoulder when she paused. She didn't tell him to stop. What she was reading was a document written several hundred years ago by a human strategist who had, apparently, described the essential nature of protracted conflict in terms that matched, with uncomfortable precision, the strategic problems the Council was currently experiencing on its eastern rim. The human had been dead for centuries. The problem had not changed. On the third day, Shankara called the humans back to the table. She had 2 things to say. She said them in order without preamble, as was her way. The first thing was, the Council's position on immediate sovereignty integration is under review. The second thing was, I want to understand how your military strategic tradition developed the conceptual framework in this document. She held up the paper. 300 years before we encountered the specific problem it describes. The historian tilted his head with the mild pleasure of someone whose field has been taken seriously. That's a very interesting question. The short answer is that we've had a lot of practice running into walls we can't break through and being forced to think around them. The longer answer requires explaining several centuries of military theory, which I am prepared to do if you have time. Shankara pulled out a chair. The meeting ran 11 hours. At the end of it, something unprecedented in council diplomatic history had occurred. The formal proceedings for integration had been suspended pending what was recorded in the official documentation as extended cooperative assessment. In the hallway afterward, Drexvahl walked beside Vasquez back toward the docking bay. He had not intended to say anything. He was still processing. But she walked with the ease of someone whose day had gone exactly as expected, and something about that finally broke his professional composure just slightly. "You came into that room knowing," he said. "The first meeting, you already knew how it would end." Vasquez looked sideways at him. "We knew how we wanted it to end, that's different." "You weren't afraid." She seemed to consider this for a moment, in the way that felt less like uncertainty and more like she was deciding how honest to be. "Oh, we were afraid," she said. "Genuinely deeply afraid. You have 14 warships and we have, feelings about our continued existence." She paused. "But fear is not the same as folding. We learned that a long time ago. Fear is information. You use it, you don't become it." He thought about the 10,000 years. The wars, the rebuilding, the compounding infrastructure of a species that had never once decided that losing meant the end of fighting. "Your species has a problem," he said. "You don't know how to stop." Vasquez smiled, and it was a real smile with something complicated behind it. "Yeah," she said, "we're working on that too." The vessel in the docking bay made its regular structural complaint against the dock clamps, a sound by now familiar enough that Drexvahl had stopped consciously hearing it. He started hearing it again now. He thought about the Eastern Rim. He thought about the Vreth Collective and the 7 council campaigns that had failed to resolve the conflict in 30 years. He thought about personnel depth and administrative loyalty and the specific quality of beings who would fight for something rather than because something was pointed at them. He filed a second report that night. It also used careful language. It said that the integration assessment was ongoing and that preliminary indications suggested that Earth's asterisk strategic value as a potential allied force warranted exploration before any sovereignty proceedings advanced. What it meant was, we made a mistake in how we classified this one. What it meant was, the footnote was the whole story. And in the Council's vast bureaucratic apparatus, for the 44th time, a file on a Tier 2 species was opened for review. But this time, for the first time, the file was reopened not to document a surrender, but to figure out what to do with a species that had looked at 14 warships and asked for a meeting. The answer was still being worked out. It would take a while. The humans were, by all accounts, patient about the things that mattered and impatient about everything else, and they had decided, apparently, that this mattered. Somewhere back on Earth, a content creator uploaded a video with the title *OK, so the aliens blinked first? And it received 40 million views in 6 hours, and in the comments section a person wrote, "We really said nah to an alien armada and somehow it worked," and another person replied, "So this is just a Tuesday for us," and it had 300,000 upvotes, which meant in the particular metrics of human cultural expression that it was correct. It was, after all, a Tuesday. It had started on a Tuesday. Some days earn their day of the week. The Eastern Rim had been burning for 30 years before the humans got there. Not burning in the metaphorical sense that people use to mean conflict, burning in the literal sense, the kind that happens when a species with no particular philosophy about proportionality decides that if they can't hold a planet, they will ensure nobody can. The Vreth Collective burned things as a matter of strategic habit, the way other species built walls, because a charred world needed no garrison and sent a message that transcended language barriers. 30 years, 11 council campaigns, 7 failed armistice agreements, 63 inhabited worlds either occupied or reduced to something the council's environmental assessment teams classified as rehabilitative candidate, long-term asterisk, which was bureaucratic language for the ecosystem, needs several centuries of not being touched by anyone. Drexvahl had been assigned to the Eastern Rim observation post 8 months into the cooperative assessment period, which was the polite name for the process of figuring out what Earth was worth and what Earth wanted in return. He understood the assignment. It was the Council's way of letting him see the problem up close, the problem they were hoping the humans might help solve, so that his field reports would carry the weight of someone who had smelled the smoke rather than read about it. He had smelled the smoke. He had also spent 8 months watching Council commanders run operations, using the strategic frameworks their academies had taught for 300 years, against an enemy that had clearly read the same frameworks and built its entire operational doctrine around the spaces in between them. The Vreth were not technologically superior to the Council. They were not more numerous. What they were was adaptive in a particular and infuriating way. They did not fight the war the Council planned for. They fought a different war, one that was always slightly to the left of wherever the Council's force was concentrated, always a week ahead of the supply chain analysis, always retreating through terrain that turned Council advantages into liabilities. It was, Drexvahl thought, reading his morning reports, recognizable. He had seen it in the human history files. He had a word for it now: insurgency. The humans called it asymmetric warfare. The historian had written a book about it. The book was on Drexvahl's desk. He had read it 3 times. The humans arrived on the Eastern Rim on what they called a Thursday, which was slightly less culturally significant than a Tuesday, but which Drexvahl was coming to understand was just how humans experience time. Every day was an ordinary day until it wasn't, and then it became a story. The force that arrived was not the 2 billion. That number, Drexvahl had come to understand, was the deep reservoir, the full weight of what humanity could become if you gave it enough reasons. What arrived was the operational element, a combined force that the humans had spent 8 months assembling, training, and arguing about internally in ways that had occasionally alarmed the Council's liaison officers before they understood that argument was how humans quality controlled their decisions. The arguments produced something the Council had not seen before: a mixed force doctrine designed specifically for the Eastern Rim's conditions, built around what the humans called distributed operations, which was a way of saying that the force was structured to be impossible to decapitate because it had no single head worth cutting off. The Council's most senior military advisor on site had looked at the organizational chart for this force and said, carefully, "Your command structure has no central node." The general in charge, a different general from the meeting table, younger, with the particular quality of someone who had been waiting their whole life for a specific kind of problem, had said, "Correct. If the senior commanders are eliminated, the operation continues. The units have standing orders and the authority to execute them. We've planned for command degradation. Every level is trained to function as the top level." The Council advisor had been quiet for a moment. "That is not how we structure operations." "We know," the general said. "That's why we're doing it differently." The first engagement did not look like a victory. Drexvahl watched the operational feeds from the observation post and spent the first 6 hours believing he was watching a poorly executed offensive. The human units advanced in fragments, apparently without coordination, hitting targets that seemed tactically marginal: supply nodes, communication relays, the small infrastructure that large operations required to breathe. The Vreth responded in their established pattern: concentrated force at the point of contact, overwhelming local resistance, repositioning. The pattern was not new. The Council had been hitting supply nodes and communication relays for 30 years. The Vreth always recovered. The infrastructure was redundant, mobile, distributed. On the morning of the second day, Drexvahl pulled the targeting map and looked at the aggregate of the previous day's apparently fragmented operations. He stared at it for a long time. The attacks were not fragmented. They were a net, drawn slowly around a specific region of Vreth-controlled space, hitting not the infrastructure itself, but the infrastructure's ability to relocate, the transport corridors, the prepositioned supply caches, the secondary fallback positions that his 30 years of observation had taught him the Vreth used with reliable consistency when pressed. They had read the Vreth pattern, not from Council intelligence files, which were thorough but looked at the problem from the wrong angle. They documented what the Vreth had done. The humans had analyzed what the Vreth would predictably do, given their established doctrine, and had built an operation specifically around the doctrine's blind spots. "They've been studying the engagement records," said his intelligence officer, appearing at his shoulder with the expression of someone who has arrived late to understanding something. "They requested access to all 30 years of campaign data 8 months ago. We gave it to them for the cooperative assessment." Drexvahel remembered the request. He had approved it himself. He had thought at the time that it was due diligence. The humans wanted to understand the conflict they were potentially entering. They had spent 8 months turning 30 years of council failure into a lesson plan. On the 4th day, 2 Vreth fleet elements entered the operational area in force, their standard overwhelming response, and found that the distributed human units had already repositioned to exactly the locations from which the Vreth flanking pattern became a liability rather than an asset. The human units did not hold their ground in the council way, fixed and resistant. They moved. Constantly, purposefully, in ways that the Vreth doctrine had not been built to track, because the Vreth doctrine had been built against an enemy that valued holding positions. The humans did not value holding positions. They valued outcomes. "They don't fight to own ground," Drexvahel said to his intelligence officer. "They fight to create conditions." The intelligence officer looked at the feeds for a moment. What does that mean? He thought about the book on his desk. He thought about the historian's mild voice in the meeting room. He thought about 10,000 years of wars fought against other humans who were just as adaptive, just as creative, just as motivated, 10,000 years of having to continuously innovate because the enemy was always also innovating. "It means they've never had the luxury of a doctrine that worked forever," he said, "so they never built one." The engagement at what the humans designated Sector 11 took 9 days. 9 days for a region of space that the Council's most ambitious campaign planners had privately estimated would require 18 months to contest meaningfully. Not to win, to contest meaningfully. To establish the conditions in which winning became conceivable. The humans contested it in 9 days. The Vreth did not flee. They were not a species that fled. What they did was something the Council's 30 years of observation had never documented. They stopped. They pulled back to established positions and stopped advancing, which in Vreth doctrine meant something the Council's xenobehavioral analysts spent 3 frantic days trying to confirm before concluding that, yes, the Vreth were doing something functionally equivalent to requesting a pause. The young general, when told this, nodded in the unhurried way of someone who had anticipated this development and found the actual timing acceptable. "They want to understand what they're dealing with," he said. "They'll conclude that we're a new threat," his intelligence officer offered. "They'll conclude that we fight differently than the Council," the general said. "Which we do, and then they'll want to know why, and then they'll want to talk because the Vreth are adaptive, that's the whole problem. They adapt. And when you show an adaptive enemy something they haven't encountered before, the first response is curiosity, not escalation." He had been right. The formal cessation of active operations in Sector 11 occurred 17 days after the human force arrived. The Vreth requested contact. The contact was opened. Drexvahel was present for the first transmitted exchange, sitting at a console in the observation post, watching history happen with a cup of something warm in his hands that was not coffee, but which he had developed a habit of drinking because being around humans for 8 months had given him new opinions about warm beverages. The Vreth's opening statement was not an offer of peace, it was a question. The question was, translated, "What manner of thing are you?" The young general had paused, and for the first time in Drexvahel's observation of him, had seemed to take a moment to find the right words rather than the efficient ones. The answer he sent back was, "We are the species that survived ourselves. We have been trying to stop fighting for 10,000 years. We are very bad at it, but we are trying. And right now, what we want is for you to stop burning things." There was a long silence on the Vreth frequency. Then, "This is an unusual negotiating position." And the general, with what Drexvahel could only read as the characteristic human combination of exhaustion and dry humor, "We are an unusual species." The formal alliance agreement between Earth and the Galactic Sovereignty Council was signed 6 weeks later, in a ceremony that the humans broadcast to their entire planet, and which received, according to monitoring reports, approximately 4 billion simultaneous viewers. The text of the agreement ran to 312 pages. It had been negotiated intensively by both sides and contained provisions that the Council's legal review teams described as unprecedented in scope and specificity which meant that the humans had insisted on including every contingency they could think of, and had thought of more contingencies than the Council's drafters had encountered in a combined 300 years of treaty work. It also contained, in the preamble, which the humans had written, and which the Council had accepted largely unchanged, because the language was better than anything the Council's diplomatic writers had produced, a single sentence that several Council scholars would later describe as the most unexpected thing to appear in a formal interstellar agreement in recorded galactic history. The sentence was, "The parties recognize that the value of this alliance derives not from the power either brings to it alone, but from what becomes possible when a species that has perfected the science of survival chooses, freely, to use that science in service of something larger than itself." Vasquez had written it. He knew this because she had mentioned it in passing at the reception after the signing ceremony, in the same offhand way she mentioned everything. "You wrote the preamble," he said. "I wrote a draft. The general changed 3 words. The historians argued about comma placement for 4 days. It was a whole thing." He looked at her. She was holding her coffee. Of course she was. "You always knew this was where it was going," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "We knew where we wanted it to go. We also knew that we had more time than you did." "How?" "Because you needed to solve your Eastern Rim problem, and we didn't need anything from you except to be left alone. That's a very comfortable negotiating position." She took a sip. "Also, and I want to say this gently, your fleet was very impressive, and we were genuinely scared, and being genuinely scared and still walking into that room and asking for a meeting took everything we had. But the thing about being scared is that it focuses you. We were very, very focused." Drexvoil thought about that. He thought about the footnote. Subject species has been in continuous organized warfare for approximately 10,000 years. Notable. He thought about what the analyst had missed, or perhaps hadn't known how to record the other side of that coin, the thing that 10,000 years of fighting yourself produced that pure military data couldn't capture. A species that had been scared, constantly, for 10 millennia. That had found every possible way that things could go wrong and had been forced to develop every possible response. That had learned at a cellular civilizational level that fear was not a wall but a door, and that on the other side of the door was always a room where someone was sharpening something. But also, and this was the part that had taken him longer to understand, the part that wasn't in any military file, a species that had been tired of fighting itself for exactly as long as it had been fighting. That had built hospitals in the same centuries it had built weapons. That had written music during sieges and painted during famines and come up with rules for its wars because somewhere, underneath all of it, there was something that refused to accept that killing each other was the final answer. The science of survival, the preamble had called it. He thought that was right. He thought there was probably no better way to describe what happened when you took the most persistently violent species in the documented galaxy and gave it, for the first time, an enemy it hadn't already beaten, and a reason to win that went beyond territory or resources or the complicated grudgework of historical grievance. You gave them a war they could believe in. The results, as it turned out, were exactly what you might expect from a species that had been practicing for 10,000 years. Outside the ceremony hall, a junior analyst from the Council's survey division was drafting the updated classification for Earth in the formal registry. The previous entry had said, Tier 2, manageable. The analyst, who had apparently read the reports and followed the Eastern Rim engagement closely, typed the new classification with the careful attention of someone who understood they were writing something permanent. It said, Alliance, Category Unprecedented. And then in the notes field, because analysts sometimes have a little room for honesty, do not approach without full briefing. They will have already read your files. Somewhere above them, in the space between the Council's fleet and the planet that had declined to be conquered, Earth turned in the ordinary light of its medium-class, unremarkable star, and the people on it went about their Tuesday, their Thursday, their whatever day it was, mostly unaware that somewhere in the galaxy's bureaucratic machinery, the word that had described their species for the previous 6 months had changed. They had been manageable. Now they were something the registry had no prior word for. They were, for the first time in 44 entries, something the galaxy had chosen. And they were, for the first time in 10,000 years of choosing every other kind of fight, choosing this one. The universe, which had seen a great many things, had not seen this before. It paid attention,